So this morning we heard in Anna and Andrew's conversation lots of references to the word risk, and I think we even heard Andrew talk about the risk-based harms approach, and our next speaker is going to tell us a bit more about what that's about. Dr. Todd Bentley is the Chief Risk Officer at the VBA, and he started there about 18 months ago. His primary role has been to develop and enhance the VBA's approach to risk management and overall assurance. In addition to this, his team has responsibility for VBA's strategy development and integration of change activities across the VBA, embedding the harms-based approach to regulation. He also is in charge of VBA's research activities and the Building Appeals Board function that is administered by the VBA. Prior to joining the VBA, Todd was a senior executive and industry leader in the rail industry and in the areas of assurance, governance, safety and system design and thinking. He's got a PhD in human factors and he's an adjunct associate professor at La Trobe University, member of the AICD and a certified professional ergonomist. Did I say that right? Ergonomist. So welcome to the stage, Todd.
Thank you so much. And so just before I kick off on anything, probably very important questions that everybody has. The Matildas start at 8 o'clock tonight, and current information says Sam Kerr is starting on the bench. So I thought you might want to know that because that was on everybody's mind, no doubt. So I would like to as well acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which we rely and acknowledge elders past and present. So as Bronwyn already indicated, I'm going to update you on the harms program of work that we're doing at the VBA. And I'm saying update because for those of you who attended the virtual conference we had last year, I did do a presentation on where we're at with harms, what we're doing, and where we're planning to go. And I'm here to give you an update as to more or less where have we been, where are we still going, and what have we achieved. So that's going to frame a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. So why do we have to adopt a harms-based approach? Well, Andrew already hinted at this in terms of we have to be able to get our resources focused in the right way on the right things at the right times to have the maximum impact on our consumers, to get the best quality, best safe outcomes of our buildings. And industry is changing, and we have to recognize that. We have lots of complex challenges. We just heard a research panel that highlighted a number of those complex challenges. And we also have, and you would have heard this from Minister Kilkenny, a real focus and a real drive to let's make sure our consumers and the people who use our buildings are safe. And certainly Anna was talking about this morning about VBA needing to focus our efforts towards those consumer outcomes. And all of that is actually built into and around our harms-based approach. So we have to figure out through this harms-based approach, how do we use our tools, our influence, our ability to educate and support, our ability to work with yourselves to get the best outcomes in the built environment. And that's what the harms-based approach really tries to encapsulate. It covers all of that. VBA also recognizes that we can't be static. We have to change with industry. We have to actually try to stay ahead of industry, which is nearly impossible with how fast this industry is moving. So that's some of the things that we have to try to do. In terms of where we're going and why is harm so important, Anna described one of the goals of the VBA, and one of her goals coming into the VBA is make the VBA a flagship regulator. What does that actually mean? Well, fortunately, Better Regulation Victoria, which just happened to be led by Anna at one point, developed this guide towards best practice regulation. It was published May last year, so just over 12 months ago. And that guide laid out 10 principles. Those 10 principles, the first 3 talk about strategy. How do you use harms effectively? And you'll see all the red circles on there. That's all the mentions of harms, and it's peppered throughout the document. Those first three principles is how do we orient our resources towards the right places and make sure we're doing the right thing. So should for a particular harm or particular issue, should we focus on education? Should we focus on engaging with other regulators? Should we actually be more a big stick approach? And that's part of that question. That's the first strategic question that we have around harms. What's the best approach to get those outcomes for the consumers? The second part is operations. How do we use those harms day in, day out to make decisions on the ground, at the coalface, about what should we do on site, or when we're running a program like this, how do we set up the program so that it has best impact or gives you the best messages? And then the last part is these enabling practices, which is really about continual improvement. It's about reflecting and understanding, are we on the right track, or is there someplace else that we should be going towards? So that's what a flagship regulator means. I still haven't told you what harms means. So what harms is on the left-hand side of your screen, you'd see a diagram. I'm hoping, yep, it is the right slide. You'll see a diagram, which if you take industry as a whole, there's issues everywhere. There's also lots of opportunities. So that's fine. We know that there's things out there. But how do we focus our efforts on the right things? And so we could do one approach, and this is a non-harms approach, is let's just pick places and go look at them. And hopefully, fingers crossed, we have the right impact. A harms-based approach says, well, no, we've identified these 6 or 5 or 3 priority pieces of work that we need to focus on, because we know if we really target those and deal with those, we will have a good impact on industry, on the outcomes, on the consumer, and then we can move on to the next one. So that's what a harms-based approach is. Let's focus and deal with those big, meaty problems where we can have maximum impact. So in terms of what we've done in terms of harms in action, and I'm going to reflect on something that Steve said this morning, is he basically said what we do is who we are. So it's not what we say we will do. So I can talk at length about harms, and trust me, sometimes I do. But what you're probably more interested in is, well, what have we done about this? Well, if I take those best practice principles, and I'll use them sort of as a guide, we have a consolidated harms register. We've identified the 14 greatest harms in our industry. We've taken and we worked on that to identify, if we take those 14, we've actually identified 6 regulatory priorities, which is I'll get to in just a second. So we have transformed our harms into these are the focus areas. Now we're taking those focus areas and translating them into action. So are we doing our education approach? If you have a look at our research program, for example, our research program is harms-based. It is addressing and targeting based on some of the key harms that we're identifying. So we are actually translating what we're talking about in harms into action. We still have a way to go. It takes time. It does take time for our people to understand what it means and how to bring it out and apply it on a day-in, day-out basis. We have fantastic people, as Anna has already mentioned, in the VBA. They make good decisions every time they're out there. They're making risk-based decisions. What we're trying to do is get those to be even more focused and more targeted towards those key issues. And of course, continual review. I mentioned at the beginning that this industry is changing. So we cannot set our harms or our regulatory priorities and leave them. We constantly have to review and renew. Now, in terms of our regulatory priorities, we have identified 6, and they were published on our website, I think maybe 2 or 3 months ago. So those are our 6 regulatory priorities. We developed these, so these priorities were based on research, evidence, data that we collect, data from industry associations, data from our auditing and inspection regime, and very importantly, also industry feedback. We've established within the VBA a committee called the Industry Harms Consultative Committee. And I'm actually very pleased, as I was chatting to people out at the breaks, every single one of those members are actually here in the room today. So thank you to everybody who participates in that committee. So thank you so much. But what that committee has done is we've done all the research, and we've been able to lay out, well, here's the harms and here's what we think the priorities. Do they seem to make sense? Because what we see as the VBA may not be what you see as industry participants. And so we rely on that feedback to make sure that what we're doing actually has a degree of validity and credibility in your eyes. So that's where these 6 harms have come from. And we're trying to address these. And these harms are not easy to address, these regulatory priorities. They're not as though we say we're going to address water ingress and it's going to be fixed in a year. We know that's not the case. We just had a set of panelists saying that this is actually a long-term and it's going to be a persistent, enduring issue. But we're still going to do the best we can to make the maximum impact and working with the industry to make buildings as safe as possible for consumers. These regulatory priorities are published on the VBA website. You can have a look at them. It dissects it into what we expect of building practitioners, and I'm including plumbers as well in that cohort. And it also talks about what we, as the VBA, are going to start doing and prioritize and focusing on. Now, where does harms fit in? I've told you that harms sort of frames and it will guide our resources and activity, but there's been a few other things that have been mentioned today. So Anna mentioned the regulatory policy statement, which is a critical document. It is going to tell everybody in Victoria and beyond what the VBA is here to do and how we're going to do it and where we're going to and why we're going to focus on things. And it's all about driving to consumer outcomes. That's sort of the top-level document. That guides everything that the VBA will be doing from a regulatory perspective. The harms program informs that to say that's how, the regulatory priority statement is this is broadly what we're doing, and this is where we're going to be doing it. The where we're going to be doing it is the harms. The tools, the compliance and enforcement policy on the right-hand side of this slide talks about what are some of the tools that we could use, whether it be building orders, directions to fix. We'll also talk about prosecution and enforcement pathways. So that's how everything sort of ties together, and that's what we are working towards. So just as my final comment, or my final slide today, is I do want to recognize that ultimately it is the building and plumbing practitioners who are our first line of defense. They are the ones that are out there, they're the ones that are building, and hopefully, and the vast majority of the times, they end up producing a compliant building, which is fantastic. We get the right outcome. However, and this is where the role of the VBA, if they did their job perfect every single day, the VBA wouldn't be required, nor would you as a building surveyor, but we know that doesn't happen. So our job is to provide a balance and a check and make sure that we can support practitioners where we can. And when practitioners are being persistent or doing something that is non-compliant, that is causing a safety issue, we can use the requisite powers, the proportionate powers to make sure that we get a safe building ultimately. So that's our role. We're there to provide that support and guidance and oversight and step in where required. But ultimately, we do have to rely on those practitioners to do the right thing. So a lot of our focus at the VBA is about how do we encourage our practitioners to do the right things? How do we support you to support our practitioners as well? As I said, addressing harms does take time. At the VBA, we are just developing up a harms-based approach. It's not fully embedded yet, and I think it's fair to say that it will take probably another couple years to get it fully embedded within the organization. And then to address these harms, as I said, some things like water ingress will take a long, long time. But we are moving on that pathway. The reason I'm sharing this with you today is because you can see what we're focusing on. You can bring that into what you do day in, day out and think, are those the same issues that I'm seeing? If not, maybe let us know. Because if you're seeing something that we're not seeing, the only way we can support you is if you tell us about it. It might also be able to focus you in on certain areas to say, actually, I have been seeing issues. I am going to be a bit more diligent about this particular area, or this is how I'm going to address things. So I do hope that you can support and look at some of these regulatory priorities and weave that into what you might do day in, day out. And I'm going to leave it there. I want to say thank you so much for your time, and I will hand back to Bronwyn.